This podcast is part of the Big Heads Media Podcast Network. Go to bigheadsmedia.com for more great podcasts.
Hello, and welcome back to the Curious Kid Podcast. Today, we will get curious about something that was invented almost 150 years ago, long before any of us were born, and is one of the most important inventions in the history of mankind. But before we do that, we have an important announcement.
Do you want to hear your voice on Curious Kid Podcast?
How amazing would that be? Well, here is your chance. Season 3 will come to an end 4 weeks from today on Sunday, March 29th. As we always do, we are going to have a special season finale with a chance for you to win something great.
3 of our listeners are going to win some Curious Kid merchandise.
That's right. You can head on over to our online shop by just clicking the link in our show notes. You can also get there by heading over to teepublic.com. That's T-E-E public.com and searching for Curious Kid Podcast. At our online shop, you will find Curious Kid Podcast shirts, tote bags, magnets, stickers, and so much more, available in lots of different colors and sizes. There are even 2 awesome Curious Kid Podcast logos to choose from.
Let them know what they have to do to win the merchandise.
Sounds good. Have you ever listened to one of our episodes and thought that we missed something about the topic of that episode? You probably have. After all, we can't possibly cover everything there is to know about these topics in just 10 or 15 minutes. Well, if you have something interesting to add about any of the topics we've already covered, we would love to hear it and share it with all of our listeners. Here's what you do. Have a grown-up record you telling us what you know about the topic and send the recording over to CuriousKidPodcast@gmail.com. We will randomly select 3 listeners that send us an email with an attached recording for our finale, and those listeners will win Curious Kid Podcast merchandise from our online shop. Don't forget to tell us your name, age, and hometown in the recording. Olivia, why don't you show them how it's done?
Hello, Curious Kid Podcast. My name is Olivia and I'm 6 years old from Voorhees, New Jersey. I know something interesting about blood that you didn't get curious about. Did you know there's gold in your blood? That's amazing!
Nicely done. Follow Olivia's lead and let us know something interesting or cool about one of the topics that we didn't mention in the episode for that topic. Please send your recordings to CuriousKidPodcast@gmail.com by Sunday, March 15th, to be eligible for the 3 giveaway prizes.
That was an awesome announcement, and we have another one at the end of the show.
You're right. It's a big one, and you're not going to want to miss it. What are we getting curious about this week?
This week we were getting curious about telephones.
The world is a really big place. But once people were able to call each other, it's as if the world got a lot smaller.
That's because you were able to talk to someone on the other side of the world by just dialing a few numbers.
Let's learn more about the history of the telephone and how telephones work. When people answer their phones today, they usually say what word?
They usually say hello.
But it hasn't always been that way.
The question of the week is, what did people used to say when they answered their phone?
There used to be a common greeting people would say when answering their phones in the very early days of telephones. What did they say instead of hello?
The word telephone comes from Greek. Tele means far and phone means voice.
So telephone really means far voice, which makes sense because it allowed people to talk to other people that were far, far away.
Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone in 1876.
That's a really long time ago. There is actually some debate over who invented the telephone, but Alexander Graham Bell gets the credit because he was the first person to be granted a patent for the telephone.
Telephones have a microphone and an earphone.
The microphone, also known as the transmitter, is the piece you speak into. The earphone, also called the receiver, is the piece you listen to. What happens when you speak into a phone is really cool. The microphone actually changes the sound waves into electrical signals. Those signals travel through cables to get to the person you are talking to. Once it reaches them, their phone changes the electrical signals back into sound waves so they can hear your voice.
The Bell Telephone Company was created in 1877.
That's just 1 year after Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone.
The first manual switchboard went into use the next year.
So you may be wondering what a switchboard is. Back in the early days of the telephone, instead of dialing someone's phone number to call them, you would have to call a switchboard and have a switchboard operator connect you with the person you were trying to reach.
Long-distance phone calls started in 1881.
Before then, you could only call people that were very close to the location you were calling from. In 1881, that all changed, as you were now able to call people far, far away.
The rotary phone came out in 1927.
And the rotary phone was a game changer. The rotary phone had a dial on it with numbers from 0 to 9. You would actually turn the dial for each number to dial the phone number you were trying to reach. For the first time, thanks to rotary phones, it was very easy to call someone directly instead of using a switchboard operator to connect you.
The first car phone was introduced in 1946, and it weighed more than me.
It weighed 80 pounds to be exact. Can you imagine an 80-pound phone?
That's silly. The 60s were a big decade for phones.
And that's because the dial pad phone replaced rotary phones. At this point, instead of having to turn the dial on a rotary phone to dial a number, there were buttons on the phone, making it much easier to make a call. Also in the 60s, the first cordless phones were introduced. This allowed you to move around the house while talking on the phone. That doesn't sound like a big deal, but until then, phones were plugged into the wall and you kind of had to stay in place while talking to someone.
Mobile phones came out in 1973.
These were phones that you could take with you anywhere. Don't get too excited though. The first mobile phones only allowed you to talk for 35 minutes before having to recharge for 10 hours. And to make matters worse, they cost almost $4,000.
Flip phones were released in 1989.
And not many people owned them because they cost about $3,000.
Smartphones started to appear in 1992.
But they weren't quite as smart as the phones of today. People were amazed when they were suddenly able to take pictures with their phones. The touch screens on some smartphones were also a hit.
In 1999, you were able to use the internet on your phone.
And just 3 years later, the BlackBerry smartphone was released, and the first iPhone was released in 2007. These days, the number of things you could do with a tiny cell phone that can comfortably fit in your pocket is amazing.
Why do we call mobile phones cell phones?
The answer is really interesting. Like we explained before, when you talk into a phone, your sound waves turn into electrical signals. But with mobile phones, those signals travel through the air instead of through wires and cables. So how do all of these electrical signals travel to where they need to go without getting all scrambled and messed up with other electrical signals? Well, instead of having all the electrical signals of all the phones bouncing around looking for their target, the map is divided into hexagonal cells. Do you know what a hexagon is?
It's a shape with 6 sides and 6 corners.
So imagine that the world is split into hexagons, and that those imaginary hexagons are connected, so they look like honeycomb. Well, each of those hexagons have a cell tower.
you would need more cells in busy areas.
You're totally right. If you live in a busy city where lots of people are using cell phones, the hexagonal cells would need to be smaller to allow the number of people inside the cell to use their cell phones. In less populated areas, the hexagonal cells can be larger. And if you're using your cell phone in the car and you drive from one cell to another, your phone call is actually handed off from one cell to the other. It's a really cool system that allows us to use our cell phones without worrying about interference with other calls.
Were you always able to send text messages on cell phones?
Nope, not always. The first text message was sent in the United Kingdom on December 3rd, 1992, and it said, "Merry Christmas." And text messages weren't that popular early on. Of course, that's probably because people used to have limits on how many text messages they could send each month. I remember thinking that text messages would never be popular, because who would take the time to type a text message when you can just call someone?
Daddy, you are very, very wrong. Text messages are very popular.
I never would have guessed how popular it would be when I first learned about text messaging. Do you want to take a guess about how many text messages are sent worldwide every minute?
I think 80 text messages are sent in every minute.
Nice guess. The correct answer is 16 million per minute. That's a whole lot of text messages.
Do you want to hear something gross? Cell phones have more bacteria than toilet handles.
And it's not even close. In a study, cell phones have 18 times more bacteria than toilet handles. That's nasty. Have you ever heard the word nomophobia? You're not going to believe what it means.
It's the fear of being without your phone.
I feel like I might know some people that suffer from nomophobia.
More people in the world have cell phones than toilets.
That's crazy to think about. There are even places like Panama, the United Arab Emirates, the Maldives, and Hong Kong where the average person owns at least 2 cell phones. In the United States, there are about 103 cell phones for every 100 people, and the average person unlocks their cell phones 110 times per day.
People are totally obsessed with their phones.
And why not? That tiny phone in your pocket has more computing power than the computers used for the Apollo 11 moon landing. How about we answer the question of the week? Back when telephones were first being used, how did people usually answer their phones? Do you want to take a guess?
I think they used to say, "Who's calling?"
The correct answer is actually ahoy.
When I hear the word ahoy, I think about pirates. Ahoy, matey!
I thought the same exact thing. I was surprised to learn that that's how people used to greet each other on the phone. Well, that's a wrap for this week's episode.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode number 74 on telephones.
Great job, Olivia. We told you we had another big announcement for everyone, and here it is. We could really use more 5-star Apple Podcast reviews. The reviews we have are outstanding. We just don't have too many of them. Positive reviews help us get noticed by people that have never listened to us before. We have something special to give anyone who leaves us a review in Apple Podcasts. If you leave a review for Curious Kid Podcast, we will give you a preview of an upcoming Curious Kid Podcast episode. We are going to call it Review for a Preview. This is what you do. After you leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, send us a quick email to CuriousKidPodcast@gmail.com to let us know it was you. I will then send you a list of all of the episodes we've recorded that have not been released yet. We usually record episodes about a month or 2 before they are released. You can then let us know which one you want to hear before anyone else gets a chance to hear it. We will then send you a link to listen to the episode of your choice in its entirety before it is released to everyone else. How cool is that? We have another great podcast to introduce you to this week. It's called Her American Story. This amazing monthly podcast tells you the story of a first or second generation American woman. The stories in this podcast are amazing, so please check it out. You can hear a promo for her American story after our outro music. If you haven't done so already, you should check out our presidential mini episodes. We are already halfway through covering all of the US presidents. By the way, the inventor of the telephone, Alexander Graham Bell, plays a very important role in the final days of President James Garfield's life. Even if you aren't particularly interested in politics, please give these mini episodes a try. I think you'll be pleasantly surprised. Next week, we will take a fantastic listener suggestion. As always, thank you so much for listening and getting curious with us.
Do you love a good story? Her American Story is a podcast for anyone who loves a good story. First and second generation American women share their American experience. Sharing our stories helps us to relate to one another, build understanding, as well as provide representation for those that need it most. I grew up in a smaller American town and lacked representation in my community and simply in media at that time. I created something I wanted to hear. I hope this podcast reaches those that need it most, as well as serves as a collection of simply interesting stories. Listen wherever you get your podcasts. Follow me on Instagram and Twitter at HerAMStory. Everyone has the story. Share yours with me. Email me at heramericanstory@gmail.com.